Bring her to me." Claudio Ferraro's voice was a low, lethal rumble that commanded the deepest shadows of the room. He sat in the opulent leather chair of his study, expecting his men to drag in a hardened thief, a rival soldier, or a cunning grifter who dared to skim from the Ferraro syndicate. But when the heavy, reinforced oak doors groaned open and she was thrown violently onto the cold, polished marble floor, the breath was punched from his lungs. It wasn't just her undeniable striking beauty, or the soft, generous curves that boldly defied the harsh, angular reality of the underworld he commanded. It was the blood, the dark, brutal, blossoming bruises painting her fair skin in a grotesque mockery of art. In that shattering, breathless moment, the ruthless mafia boss didn't see an enemy of the state. He saw a horrific, profound injustice, and his cold, heavily guarded heart completely and irrevocably broke. The rain lashed against the reinforced floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office, distorting the glittering, sprawling skyline of Chicago into a blurred, weeping canvas of neon and shadow. Claudio Ferraro stood with his broad back to the expansive room, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid held loosely in a hand, scarred by a violent, unrelenting past. He was a man carved from marble and severe consequence, broad-shouldered, towering, and exuding a quiet, terrifying strength that commanded absolute obedience. At 38, he was the undisputed head of the Ferraro syndicate, a mantle he had inherited in blood and secured with cold, calculating intellect. Claudio operated in the darkest corners of the city, yet he clung strictly to a personal, almost archaic code of honor, a dangerous rarity in a world built entirely on betrayal, shifting alliances, and cheap violence. He did not traffic in human lives. He despised the narcotics trade. He strictly forbade targeting civilians, and he demanded absolute, unwavering discipline from his ranks. He was a monster to some, a strict patriarch to others, but he was always, above all else, a man of his word. Behind him, the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut with a definitive thud. Marcus Vance, his smooth-talking, impeccably dressed underboss, stepped into the dimly lit sanctuary. Marcus was a man who navigated the treacherous waters of the underworld with a politician's smile and a viper's strike. His suit was tailored to perfection, a sharp contrast to the ugly, street-level news he usually carried up to the penthouse. "We have a problem in the South Side territory, boss," Marcus began, pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. His voice dripped with calculated concern, smooth and practiced. "One of the local businesses is skimming. More than that, they set up a crew of our boys. Tony was injured during a routine collection run yesterday. A busted rib, a fractured orbital bone, and he's spitting teeth." Claudio turned slowly, the movement deliberate and predatory. His dark, piercing eyes locked onto Marcus, analyzing every micro-expression. The mere thought of a civilian business taking up arms against his men was not just absurd, it was suicidal. Yet the mention of Tony, a hulking, ruthless capo Claudio, had been keeping a very close eye on due to whispers of excessive force, sparked a hot, immediate flicker of suspicion. Tony was a blunt instrument, not a diplomat. "Who?" Claudio demanded. His voice was barely above a whisper, a low baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. Yet it echoed with an undeniable, terrifying authority. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "A bakery owner. A woman named Eva Bernard," Marcus replied smoothly, walking over to the massive claw-footed desk and sliding a thin manila folder across the polished wood. "She's been withholding the agreed-upon protection payments for 3 months. Tony gave her grace, considered the economic climate, But when he went to finally enforce the contract yesterday, she had a local street gang waiting for him in the alley. She's dangerous, Claudio. Emboldened. Defiant. If word gets out that a local baker is pushing back and injuring our capos, we lose the streets. The other neighborhoods will think we've gone soft. Claudio picked up the folder, his jaw clenching. He opened it to reveal a single surveillance photo. It was grainy, shot from a distance, showing a woman standing outside a colorful storefront, laughing heartily at something out of frame. Even through the poor quality of the print, her presence was magnetic, drawing the eye instantly. She was a plus-sized woman, carrying her weight with a regal, unapologetic confidence that fascinated him. Her thick dark hair cascaded in wild waves over her shoulders, and her smile seemed to radiate a genuine warmth that illuminated the bleak, grey city street around her. She didn't look like a crime boss. She didn't look like a hardened gang leader orchestrating ambushes. She looked like warmth incarnate, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating world Claudio inhabited. Yet Claudio knew better than most that appearances could be deceiving. The rules of the underworld were absolute, written in blood and maintained by fear. Weakness invited wolves, and hesitation meant death. If she had ordered an attack on his men, if she was rallying local gangs to challenge Ferraro authority, an example had to be made, regardless of how innocent and radiant she appeared in a stolen photograph. Claudio's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering near his ear. He tossed the folder back onto the expansive desk, the slap of the cardboard sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I want the absolute truth of this, Marcus," Claudio said, his tone uncompromising and laced with a subtle warning. "I want her pulled from the streets before she causes a riot in my territory or inspires other fools to test us. But hear me clearly. Do not make a spectacle of it. No broad daylight theatrics. No civilian casualties. Just get her. Consider it done, boss." Marcus nodded eagerly, perhaps a little too eagerly, turning on his heel to leave. "And Marcus," Claudio's voice stopped the underboss dead in his tracks at the door. "Bring her to me. Here. I want to look this woman in the eyes when she explains why she thought she could bleed my family and live." Eva Bernard wiped a smudge of fine white flour from her forehead with the back of her forearm, leaving a pale streak across her warm, olive skin. The bakery, Sweet Haven, was exactly that, her sanctuary, her kingdom, and her life's work. It was a tiny, bustling shop nestled on a busy corner of 4th Street, filled from floor to ceiling with the intoxicating, comforting aromas of melting butter, rich Madagascar vanilla, caramelized sugar, and rising yeast. At 28, Eva was a woman who took up space and made absolutely no apologies for it. She was voluptuous, remarkably strong from hauling 50-pound sacks of flour, and deeply beautiful, with expressive, intelligent hazel eyes that missed nothing of the world around her. She had built this business from literal scratch, pouring her soul into the old brick oven, working grueling 18-hour days to support herself and her younger brother Leo. Leo was her heart walking outside her body, a brilliant, sensitive kid, currently surviving his sophomore year at a prestigious university across town, blissfully unaware of the sacrifices his sister made to keep his tuition paid. But the pervasive warmth of the bakery, usually a haven for the neighborhood, had been deeply tainted over the last 3 agonizing months. A shadow had fallen over 4th Street. The bell above the glass door chimed, not with the usual cheerful tinkle of a customer, but violently, as the door was shoved open with brutal force. Eva's heart plummeted into her stomach as she looked up from the delicate work of frosting a wedding cake on the front counter. Tony. He was a hulking, sneering brute of a man, his face a canvas of ugly, swelling bruises, a fresh purple shiner, and a nasty split lip from a bar fight he'd instigated 2 nights prior at the local pub. He was sweating despite the chill outside, his cheap cologne failing to mask the sour smell of stale beer and violence. He was not here for the famous cinnamon rolls. He was here for the protection money, a vicious extortion racket he was running under the table, bleeding the neighborhood dry without the higher-ups' knowledge, terrorizing the small business owners who were too afraid to go to the police. "Time's up, sweetheart," Tony growled, slamming a meaty, calloused hand onto the delicate glass display case, making the pastries inside jump. 2 of his identical, equally thuggish companions flanked the door. One flipped the open sign to closed, while the other yanked the heavy blinds down, plunging the cheerful shop into an ominous, claustrophobic gloom. Eva felt the familiar spike of terror, but she forced it down, standing tall and squaring her shoulders, refusing to let her hands tremble where Tony could see them. "I told you last week, Tony, and the week before that." "I don't have it," Eva said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Flour prices went up 30%. The main oven needed emergency repairs, and I am barely breaking even this month. Besides, this neighborhood doesn't need your kind of protection. We were fine before you started circling like vultures." Tony's eyes darkened, narrowing into ugly slits. "You don't get to dictate the terms, fatty," he spat, his voice dropping into a menacing hiss as he moved heavily around the counter, invading her space. "You pay the toll, or we take it out in trade. Maybe we start by smashing those expensive, fancy ovens you care so much about. Or—" He paused, a cruel, predatory smile twisting his battered face. "Maybe we pay little Leo a visit at his dorm. I hear college boys are soft, break easily." The mention of her brother acted like gasoline on a smoldering fire. The fear vanished, replaced instantly by a fierce, blinding, protective rage that roared in Eva's chest. She didn't think. She reacted. She reached under the counter and grabbed the heaviest thing her hand bumped into, a solid steel, commercial-grade rolling pin. "You stay the hell away from my brother!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Tony lunged, his massive hands reaching for her throat. Eva swung the heavy steel pin with all the momentum her strong frame could generate, catching him squarely on the shoulder with a sickening thud. Tony roared in genuine pain, stumbling backward, clutching his arm. But the advantage was fleeting. He was a seasoned street brawler. She was a baker. The 2 thugs at the door rushed her before she could swing again. One grabbed a fistful of her thick hair, yanking her violently backward, arching her spine painfully. The other stepped in and backhanded her with crushing, unforgiving force. The metallic taste of copper instantly flooded her mouth as her lip split. She didn't surrender. She fought like a cornered lioness, kicking wildly, biting at the arm holding her hair, screaming for help that she knew wouldn't come through the closed blinds. She used her sturdy frame, throwing her weight backward to knock one of the men off balance, sending him crashing into a rack of cooling bread. But they were armed, trained, and utterly remorseless. A heavy, rings-clad fist connected solidly with her left cheekbone, sending blinding white flashes of agony through her vision. Another brutal blow struck her ribs, knocking the wind from her lungs in a sharp gasp. She collapsed heavily to the flour-dusted tiled floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come, her beautiful face already swelling aggressively, the skin turning a sickening, vibrant shade of violet. Tony stood over her, breathing heavily, massaging his injured shoulder. "The boss wants to see you," he hissed, spitting a glob of blood onto her pristine floor. "Let's see how tough you are, how much you run your mouth, when Claudio Ferraro is done with you. Bag her." A rough, Foul-smelling burlap sack was forced violently over her head, scraping against her bruised cheeks and plunging her into suffocating darkness. Panic and searing physical pain threatened to consume her entirely. But as they dragged her roughly out the back door by her arms and threw her like a sack of garbage into the dark, cramped trunk of a waiting sedan, Eva clamped her jaw shut so hard her teeth ached. She would not beg these monsters. She would not let them hear her cry. She would not break. The grand foyer of the Ferraro estate, in the exclusive northern suburbs, was a breathtaking testament to old-world wealth and generational power. It featured sweeping double staircases of imported marble, a massive, glittering crystal chandelier that cast fractured light across the room, and floors so pristine they reflected the imposing figures standing upon them. Claudio stood perfectly still at the center of the vast room, flanked by his most trusted, heavily armed personal guards. He was dressed in a meticulously tailored black suit, exuding an aura of absolute, terrifying control. He felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the necessary detachment required to interrogate and punish the mastermind who had allegedly orchestrated a hit on his capo and dared to challenge his empire. The heavy ornate front doors swung open with a groan. Tony and his two men entered, tracking mud and rainwater onto the marble, dragging a struggling, bound figure between them. "Here she is, boss. Just like you asked," Tony announced proudly, his chest puffed out as he shoved the captive forward roughly. Eva, her hands bound painfully tight behind her back with industrial zip ties, lost her footing on the slick marble. With her vision obscured by the hood and her equilibrium shattered by the beating, she couldn't catch herself. She crashed hard onto her knees, the sharp impact echoing in the cavernous room, a sharp, involuntary cry of pain escaping her lips before she could bite it back. One of the thugs stepped forward and yanked the burlap sack roughly from her head, taking a clump of her hair with it. Claudio took a measured step forward, a cold, calculated interrogation prepared on his tongue. He was ready to dismantle a rival. But as his dark eyes fell upon the woman kneeling on the floor, the words evaporated from his mind, replaced by a sudden, chilling void. The silence in the grand foyer became absolute, thick, and suffocating. She was breathtakingly beautiful, her full, curvaceous figure possessing a classical, undeniable elegance that the torn, flour-dusted, and blood-stained clothes could not hide. The surveillance photo hadn't done her justice, but what paralyzed Claudio, what sent a profound shockwave of cold, nauseating horror straight through his veins and froze him in his tracks, was the horrific state of her face. Her left eye was already swollen completely shut, surrounded by an angry, blooming canvas of black, deep purple and sickly yellow. Her lower lip was split deeply, a trail of dark, dried blood trailing down her chin and staining the collar of her shirt. Deep, ugly bruises marred her exposed collarbone where she had been grabbed, and she was shaking slightly. A fine, uncontrollable tremor, born of severe shock and immense pain. Yet, as she slowly tilted her head up to look at the towering man standing over her, her one good, hazel eye blazed with an unyielding, furious dignity that took his breath away. She looked at him not with the expected terror of a captive, but with the burning contempt of a queen staring down a tyrant. Claudio felt a literal, physical snap in his chest. His heart, long hardened to the pervasive violence of his world, scarred by years of ruthless decisions, broke in a single agonizing heartbeat. It was a visceral reaction, an ancient instinct roaring to life. His strict, unshakable rule, the absolute, foundational prohibition against harming women and innocents that separated him from the animals he warred with, had not just been broken, it had been violently, casually shattered in his own home by men wearing his colors. The temperature in the vast room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Claudio's gaze shifted slowly, terrifyingly, from Eva's battered, beautiful face to Tony. The Mafia boss's dark eyes were suddenly entirely devoid of humanity. He didn't look angry. He looked like the devil himself, cold and absolute. "Who did this?" Claudio's voice was a terrifyingly calm, vibrating hum. It was the sound a predator makes right before the kill. Tony, thick-headed and misreading the lethal stillness of the room completely, puffed out his chest further, seeking praise. "She was resisting, boss. Fought like a rabid dog, screaming and kicking. We had to rough her up a bit to bring her in. She ain't as soft as she looks." In a blur of motion incredibly fast for a man of his immense size, Claudio crossed the distance. He didn't speak. He grabbed Tony by the thick column of his throat with one massive hand, lifting the 300-pound enforcer completely off his feet. The sickening wet crack of Tony's windpipe compressing echoed horrifyingly in the grand hall. Tony's eyes bulged, his hands clawing uselessly at Claudio's iron grip. "You put your hands on a woman?" Claudio roared, the sudden explosion of volume shaking the crystal chandelier above them. "You beat her like a dog in the street? Under my name?" With a roar of pure, unfiltered rage, Claudio threw Tony against a solid stone pillar with bone-shattering force. Tony crumpled to the marble floor like a discarded rag doll, gasping wetly, coughing up bright red blood, his collarbone visibly deformed. Claudio spun around to face the other two thugs. The arrogant smirks had vanished, replaced by stark terror. They were trembling, instinctually reaching for the weapons holstered under their jackets. "Disarm them," Claudio commanded his personal guards, his voice returning to that deadly, icy calm. "Take them to the subcellar. Chain them to the wall. I will deal with them myself when I am finished here." As his heavily armed guards descended on the two men, dragging them kicking and screaming away toward the lower levels of the estate, Claudio slowly turned back to Eva. The demonic rage melted from his face instantly, replaced by a profound, agonizing guilt that made him look suddenly vulnerable. He dropped heavily to his knees on the hard, cold marble, completely ignoring the dirt and Tony's blood pooling nearby, placing his large frame at eye level with her. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. His large hands, usually so steady, were trembling visibly as he reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket for a silver, custom-made pocket knife. Carefully, with an excruciating gentleness that belied his size, he slid the sharp blade under the thick plastic zip ties binding her wrists, cutting her free. He tossed the plastic aside. "You are safe now. I swear it to you on my life." Eva slowly brought her arms forward, wincing as she rubbed her raw, bleeding wrists. She stared wide-eyed at the terrifying mafia boss who was currently kneeling before her on the blood-stained marble like a penitent sinner seeking absolution. Her head throbbed in a relentless, agonizing rhythm perfectly synced with her racing heartbeat, and her ribs screamed with every shallow breath. But her mind was remarkably clear. This man, Claudio Ferraro, was supposed to be the architect of her misery, the dark overlord who ordered her destruction. Yet the raw horror she had seen flash in his dark eyes when he beheld her bruised face was undeniable. It wasn't a performance. It was visceral, raw, and shockingly real. "Safe?" Eva rasped, her voice thick and wet from the split lip, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She didn't cower. "Your men dragged me from my bakery like an animal. They threatened to maim my little brother. They beat me senseless because I couldn't pay their ridiculous extortion money. If this is what safety looks like in your twisted world, Mr. Ferraro, I'd rather take my chances burning in hell." Claudio stood up slowly, his face tight with controlled emotion. He offered his large, scarred hand to help her up. Eva looked at it for a second, then pointedly ignored it. Gritting her teeth against the blinding pain in her side, she painfully pushed herself up to her feet. She swayed slightly but forced herself to stand proudly, refusing to shrink, refusing to let him see her break, letting him see every ounce of her beautiful, bruised, defiant form. Claudio slowly withdrew his hand, a deep, undeniable respect flashing in his dark eyes. "Extortion money?" Claudio repeated the words as if they were a foreign language, his thick brow furrowed in genuine, profound confusion. "Miss Bernard, you were brought here because my underboss informed me you were running a sophisticated skimming operation from our legitimate supply chains, and that you had orchestrated an armed, gang-related assault on Tony yesterday." Eva stared at him for a long moment, then let out a harsh, bitter laugh that ended abruptly in a sharp hiss as her bruised ribs flared with agonizing pain. She clutched her side. "I own a bakery, Mr. Ferraro," she said, her voice dripping with incredulous disdain. "I bake sourdough bread and vanilla cupcakes. I decorate wedding cakes. I don't know the first damn thing about supply chains or street gangs. Tony and his goons have been systematically shaking down every single small, family-owned business on 4th Street for 3 months. Protection money, they called it. $1,000 a week. When I told him today that I couldn't pay, that I had nothing left to give, he threatened to send his men to my brother's college dorm. So, I did what anyone would do. I hit him with a steel rolling pin." Claudio closed his eyes, a muscle feathering violently in his jaw. The silence in the room stretched, thick with terrible realization. The betrayal ran deep, far deeper than a rogue capo. Marcus Vance, his smooth-talking, trusted underboss, the man who sat at his right hand, had looked him in the eye and fed him a carefully constructed, elaborate lie. Tony wasn't just a rogue enforcer acting out. He was running an organized, unsanctioned racket right under Claudio's nose, bleeding the very community Claudio had sworn to protect and keep clean, and Marcus was covering for him, likely taking the lion's share of the cut. "I have been lied to," Claudio finally said, his voice deadly quiet, echoing with the promise of horrific violence. He opened his eyes, and they were cold, dark voids. "And because of my blindness, because of my misplaced trust in a traitor, you have suffered an unforgivable wrong." He turned sharply to his head of security, a towering, stoic man named Dante, who stood silently by the door. "Dante, call Dr. Rossi. Have him drop whatever he is doing and come to the guest wing immediately. And lock down the estate. Full perimeter lockdown. No one enters, no one leaves. Put armed men on the skates. And find Marcus Vance. Bring him to the study." Claudio turned back to Eva, the coldness in his eyes softening instantly as he looked at her battered face. "Miss Bernard, you need immediate medical attention. You are in immense physical pain, and you are running on adrenaline that will soon crash. Allow me to offer you my personal doctor and a safe, secure place to rest while I sort out this treason." "I want to go home," Eva said stubbornly, though the edges of her vision were beginning to blur and the room was starting to pitch like a ship at sea. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the crushing agony. "You can't," Claudio replied softly, taking a cautious step closer, desperately wanting to reach out and steady her swaying frame, but afraid to touch her. "Tony was running a highly illegal operation behind my back. If he is doing this, there are others involved. If you return to the streets tonight, if Marcus realizes the truth is out, his loyalists will kill you to keep you quiet. They will silence you before you can testify to me. Stay here, just for tonight. Let my doctor treat your wounds, and let me dismantle the monsters operating in my own house." Eva looked deep into Claudio's dark, intense eyes. She saw the vast capacity for violence there, yes, but she also saw a rigid, unwavering truth, a desperate need to make amends. She felt a strange, inexplicable sense of safety radiating from the very man who should have been her worst nightmare. She nodded once, slowly. Before the nod was complete, her knees finally buckled, the pain and exhaustion overwhelming her completely. Before she could hit the hard marble, Claudio moved. He caught her with shocking speed, his strong, muscular arms scooping her up with incredible gentleness. He held her voluptuous, limp frame securely against his broad chest, marveling at the softness of her despite her fierce spirit, as he carried her swiftly up the sweeping grand staircase toward the safety of the guest wing. For 3 long, agonizing days, Eva remained confined to the luxurious, sprawling guest wing of the Ferraro estate. Dr. Rossi, an older, discreet man who asked no questions, had treated her injuries with expert care. He wrapped her bruised ribs tightly, stitched her split lip with fine thread, applied soothing, medicated salves to her swollen face, and prescribed heavy painkillers that left her drifting in and out of a fuzzy sleep. The physical healing was surprisingly quick, aided by her own robust health and stubborn constitution, but the emotional tension crackling through the mansion was palpable, thick enough to choke on. She could hear the muffled sounds of heavy boots in the hallways, the sharp, terse commands shouted in Italian, and the underlying hum of a kingdom preparing for war. Claudio visited her every single evening. It became a strange, quiet ritual. He never overstepped, never entered the room uninvited. He always stood tall by the door frame, usually dressed in a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing heavily tattooed forearms. He would ask in his low rumble if she had everything she needed, if the pain was manageable, if the food was to her liking. Eva, in turn, found herself intensely fascinated by the man. He was a walking paradox. He commanded a vast criminal empire that struck fear into the heart of the city. Yet he treated her with an almost reverent gentleness, speaking to her as if she were made of spun glass. She saw the deep circles under his eyes, the heavy weight of his crown pressing down on him. On the 4th evening, the painkillers had worn off, and Eva grew profoundly restless. She was dressed in a soft, flowing silk robe provided by the estate's staff. It was a rich emerald green that complemented her dark hair and warm olive skin perfectly. Her generous curves filled the slippery fabric beautifully, a fact that she noticed Claudio was acutely, almost painfully aware of during his brief visits, even as he tried politely, fiercely, to avert his dark eyes out of respect. She needed to move. She needed to feel useful. She ventured cautiously out of her room, wandering the quiet, heavily guarded halls, marveling at the priceless art and oppressive silence, until she finally found the estate's massive, state-of-the-art kitchen. It was empty, gleaming with stainless steel and smelling faintly of bleach. The desire to bake, to do something normal, tactile, and grounding in this surreal environment, was sudden and overwhelming. She found flour, butter, sugar, and yeast in the massive walk-in pantry. An hour later, Claudio, exhausted from hours of grueling interrogations in the sub-cellar, followed the warm, utterly foreign scent of cinnamon and baking bread down the hall. He stopped dead in the doorway of the kitchen, mesmerized by the sight before him. Eva was standing at the massive central island counter, humming a soft, upbeat tune, her hips swaying slightly to the rhythm as she expertly kneaded a large ball of dough. The angry purple bruises on her face were finally fading to a mottled yellow and green, and the vibrant life had returned to her bright hazel eyes. She looked magnificent, a vibrant, undeniably beautiful force of life and warmth in the center of his cold, empty, blood-soaked home. She looked like everything he had ever been denied. "You shouldn't be working," Claudio said softly, his voice rougher than usual, stepping cautiously into the room as if approaching a skittish animal. "Dr. Rossi said you needed rest." Eva didn't stop kneading, her strong hands working the dough with practiced rhythm. "It's not work, Claudio. It's therapy. I need to use my hands." She gestured around the room with a flowery hand. "Your kitchen is incredible, by the way. Better than most commercial setups I've seen. Though your pantry is severely lacking in quality vanilla." She paused, wiping her hands on a towel and looking at him properly for the first time. "You look terrible. You look tired." It was the first time she had used his first name, without the formal Mr. Ferraro. The sound of it falling from her lips sent a sharp, unexpected jolt straight to his core. He sighed heavily, dropping the imposing facade for a moment, and rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the knots of tension there. "I have been pulling the weeds from my garden," Claudio admitted, his voice exhausted. "It is far more extensive than I feared. Marcus has deeply, systematically entrenched this corruption over the last 2 years. He's been moving heavy narcotics through our legitimate shipping ports, ignoring my strict embargo, and using the extortion money from neighborhoods like yours to pay off the harbor masters and bribe local politicians. He's building an army with my money. He's planning a coup." Eva wiped her hands clean, walked slowly around the counter, and stood mere inches from him. She had to tilt her head up to look into his exhausted, shadowed face. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. The fear had been entirely replaced by a profound empathy. She didn't see the monster the city feared. She saw a man being crushed by the heavy burden of leadership and profound betrayal. "Then why don't you just stop him?" she asked simply, the solution seemingly obvious to her. "You are the boss." Claudio looked down at her, a bitter smile touching his lips. "Because, Eva, to cut Marcus out completely, to purge his loyalists, means going to absolute war with half my own family. It means tearing the syndicate apart from the inside. Blood will spill in the streets. Innocent people might get caught in the crossfire." "Blood is already spilling, Claudio," Eva said gently, reaching out on pure instinct to touch his arm. Her soft, warm hand, resting against his muscular forearm, was a sharp, electrifying contrast. "They hurt me. They terrorized my neighbors. They will hurt others if you let them continue. You have all this power, all these men. What good is it if you don't use it to protect the people who can't protect themselves? A king who lets wolves feed on his sheep isn't a king. He's a coward." Claudio froze at her touch, looking down at her small hand on his arm, then slowly bringing his gaze up to meet her fierce, demanding eyes. The space between them seemed to vanish entirely. He could smell the sweet vanilla on her skin, mingling with the scent of cinnamon. Driven by a need he couldn't control, he slowly reached up, his large, calloused hand hovering for a second before gently, reverently tracing the unbruised side of her jawline. A profound, undeniable connection crackled between them, thick and electric. He admired her full, gorgeous body, yes, but he was entirely captivated by her fierce spirit, her absolute, unwavering fearlessness in the face of his darkness. "I will tear it all down for you," he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them, his voice dark, heavy, and laden with a terrifying promise. I will burn this corrupt empire to the fucking ground to ensure you, and people like you, are never touched again. While Eva and Claudio found a fragile, unspoken solace in each other's presence within the fortified walls of the estate, the dark, rotting underbelly of Chicago was boiling over into open rebellion. Across town, in a smoky, secluded warehouse down by the docks, Marcus Vance was pacing the concrete floor like a caged, starving tiger. Tony sat heavily at a metal table, his arm in a thick sling, his shoulder immobilized, and his neck bruised black, blue, and yellow from Claudio's terrifying grip days prior. He looked broken, but his eyes burned with hatred. "He knows," Marcus spat, lighting a cigarette with trembling, agitated hands. He blew a stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Claudio is isolating his loyalists. He's pulled the financial books. He's looking deep into the port ledgers. That fat Baker woman is talking. She's poisoned his mind." "I told you we should have just killed her in the shop and dumped her in the river," Tony rasped, his voice a damaged, painful wheeze. "Dead women don't tell tales. If you had killed a civilian, Claudio would have flayed you alive and hung you from the bridge," Marcus snapped, shooting Tony a look of pure disgust. "He's obsessed with his precious code. But now she has him twisted around her finger. Claudio has gone soft. He talks of honor and rules in a business built entirely on blood and leverage. We need to strike first, before he finishes his purge. We strike tonight." Marcus slammed his hands on the table, outlining a desperate, brutal, all-or-nothing plan. He had spent the last 2 days calling in every favor, every bribe. He had paid off the captain of Claudio's outer perimeter guards with a suitcase full of untraceable cash. They would bypass the heavy iron gates, breach the main house under the cover of a storm, and eliminate Claudio in his own sanctuary. As for the Baker woman, she would be made a horrific example of. Her death would send a message to the entire city that the old rules were dead. Back at the estate, Eva was experiencing a rare, fleeting moment of peace. The storm outside was raging, heavy rain lashing against the windows, but inside she was warm. She was in the massive 2-story library, curled up comfortably in a deep leather armchair with a heavy historical novel, when she heard a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, barely audible over the thunder, but distinct. Pfft. The unmistakable dull cough of a suppressed gunshot. She froze, the book slipping from her lap. Her heart instantly hammered violently against her healing ribs. She crept silently to the heavy oak door, opened it a fraction of an inch, and peered out. In the long, dimly lit hallway, one of the perimeter guards, a man she had seen laughing with the staff yesterday, was lowering a suppressed weapon, standing coldly over the bleeding body of one of Claudio's personal, trusted inner circle guards. The traitor reached for the radio on his shoulder. "Breach successful. South wing is clear. Move in. Find the target." Eva slapped a hand over her own mouth to stifle a terrified gasp, her eyes wide with horror. They were already inside. The corruption hadn't just seeped into the lower ranks. It was inside the house. It was knocking on Claudio's bedroom door. She couldn't hide in the library and hope for the best. She had to warn him. Discarding her soft slippers to move quietly, Eva sprinted silently down the thick, carpeted hallway in her bare feet. She knew Claudio's private office was at the far end of the East Wing. She used her intimate knowledge of the estate, gained from her restless, late-night wanderings over the past few days, to slip through the narrow, hidden servants' corridors, bypassing the heavily armed, masked men filtering into the main foyer like shadows. She was a big woman, but terror made her light. She moved with a desperate, fluid grace, fueled entirely by adrenaline and a terrifying, sudden realization that made her chest ache. She couldn't let Claudio die. She cared for him. Claudio was sitting at his massive desk, deeply engrossed in analyzing the falsified shipping manifests, illuminated only by a single desk lamp, when the heavy oak doors of his office flew open with a bang. He reached for the heavy, loaded pistol mounted under his desk instantly, his reflexes honed by years of paranoia, but paused, his finger on the trigger, when Eva stumbled in. She was breathless, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with absolute terror. "They're inside," she gasped, practically throwing herself against the door, throwing the heavy deadbolt and locking it behind her with shaking hands. "Marcus's men. They killed your guard in the South Hall. I saw him fall. They're coming for you, Claudio." Claudio's eyes went completely, terrifyingly cold. The war had finally arrived at his doorstep. He didn't panic. He didn't waste time on disbelief. He moved with lethal, practiced precision. He grabbed a heavy tactical shotgun from a hidden biometric wall compartment and tossed a smaller, sleek 9mm handgun across the room onto the leather sofa. "Do you know how to use that?" he asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion, racking the shotgun with a loud metallic clack. "I know how to bake bread, Claudio," she hissed, her panic rising as the heavy, ominous sound of multiple footsteps echoed loudly in the corridor outside. "I don't shoot people." "Stay behind the mahogany desk. Get low and stay low," Claudio ordered, his eyes fixed on the door. "It's reinforced steel beneath the wood. It will stop small arms fire. Do not move from that spot until I tell you." Gunfire erupted, shattering the stillness. The heavy office doors splintered violently under a hail of automatic weapons fire. Wood flew like jagged shrapnel, tearing into the leather chairs and antique globes. Claudio returned fire instantly, the booming roar of the shotgun deafening in the enclosed space. He was a terrifying force of nature, stepping into the line of fire and dropping two masked men instantly as they tried to breach the doorway, their bodies blocking the entrance. But there were too many. They were pouring into the hallway. A stray bullet grazed Claudio's shoulder, tearing through his shirt and biting into flesh, spinning him backward with the force of the impact. He dropped to one knee behind a heavy, overturned leather sofa, gritting his teeth against the pain. From beneath the desk, her hands over her ears, Eva saw a third man slip stealthily into the room through the shattered remains of the door, stepping over his dead comrades. He was raising his weapon, aiming directly toward Claudio's blind spot as the Mafia boss reloaded the shotgun. Claudio was unaware of the immediate threat. Instinct, raw and primal, overrode her paralyzing fear. Eva didn't try to scramble for the gun. She knew she would fumble it or miss entirely. Instead, she grabbed the heaviest thing in reach, a solid, antique brass lamp sitting on the floor beside the desk. Her strong, capable arms, used to hauling and lifting 50-pound bags of flour daily, launched the heavy brass object flawlessly across the room. It sailed through the air and caught the assassin squarely in the side of the head with a sickening crack. The man crumpled instantly, his gun clattering uselessly to the floor. Claudio finished reloading, spun around, and dispatched the remaining attackers lingering in the doorway with two deafening blasts. Silence suddenly fell over the ruined, smoking office, broken only by the loud ringing in their ears, the drumming of rain against the glass, and the acrid, choking smell of cordite and blood. Claudio looked at the unconscious man on the floor, the dented brass lamp beside him, and then slowly looked at Eva, who was shaking violently beneath the desk, her knees pulled to her chest. He dropped his weapon onto the sofa and rushed to her, pulling her out from under the desk and pulling her tightly into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, clutching his torn, bloody shirt desperately. "You saved my life," he whispered fiercely into her tangled hair, holding her so tight he was afraid he might break her. "You brave, beautiful, incredible woman. You saved me." He pulled back slightly, cupping her face in his large, blood-stained hands, staring at her with a burning intensity that incinerated all the violence and death in the room. In that chaotic, terrifying moment, amidst shattered glass, spent casings and bleeding bodies, Claudio kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, bruising, claiming, and filled with a profound gratitude and an undeniable, overwhelming passion that had been building for days. Eva kissed him back just as fiercely, pouring all her lingering fear, relief, and her profound, newfound affection for this dangerous man into the embrace. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Claudio's eyes were completely changed. The man of restraint, the boss who sought a peaceful resolution, was gone. The ruthless, unleashed protector had awakened. "Stay here with Dante," Claudio commanded, as his trusted security chief, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, rushed into the ruined room with a team of loyal men. "Lock down the wing, keep her safe. I am ending this tonight." The rain had turned into a torrential, blinding downpour, turning the streets of Chicago into slick black rivers as Claudio drove his heavily armored SUV straight through the chained iron gates of the port warehouse where Marcus was orchestrating his coup. He didn't come with an army. A large force would be clumsy and loud. He came with a handful of completely loyal elite men, heavily armed and burning with the same cold, righteous fury as their boss. The vast warehouse was a dark, echoing labyrinth of towering shipping containers and heavy machinery. A fierce, cinematic gunfight erupted almost immediately. Muzzle flashes illuminated the dark, wet night like violent strobe lights, casting long, monstrous shadows against the metal walls. The deafening roar of automatic fire echoed over the thunder. Claudio moved through the chaos like an avenging angel of death. His tailored suit was ruined, his face smeared with grease, rain, and blood. He systematically dismantled Marcus's forces, relying on superior, brutal tactics and a terrifying, cold-blooded efficiency that left no room for mercy. He was a surgeon cutting out a cancer. He finally cornered Marcus and Tony in the elevated, glass-enclosed central office overlooking the sprawling warehouse floor. Tony, clutching his injured shoulder, tried desperately to raise a weapon with his good arm, but Claudio fired without breaking stride, taking the brutal capo out permanently with a single precise shot to the center of his chest. Tony fell backward, shattering the glass wall and tumbling down to the concrete floor below. Marcus dropped his gun, raising his hands in a frantic, pathetic surrender, backing away until he hit the desk. "Claudio, wait, please. We can make a deal. It was just business. It's the way the world works. You know this." Claudio walked up the metal stairs slowly, his heavy boots ringing out against the steel like a slow, deliberate death knell. He kicked Marcus's discarded gun away and grabbed the terrified underboss by the lapels of his expensive suit, slamming him violently against the remaining reinforced glass window. The glass cracked under the impact. "You targeted innocents." Claudio's voice was a guttural, terrifying snarl, completely devoid of the sophisticated veneer he usually wore. "You bled my city dry to line your own pockets. You brought war into my home. And you dared to lay hands on a woman whose heart is worth more than your entire, miserable, worthless existence. She's a nobody," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror, desperate to make Claudio see reason. "She's a fat baker from the slums. She's nothing." Claudio's eyes flashed with a lethal, blinding rage. "She is everything you will never be, Marcus. She is truth. She is strength. She is dignity." Claudio didn't kill Marcus. He did something infinitely worse to a man whose entire life was built on power and perception. He stripped him of everything. "Dante," Claudio called out to his security chief, who had just secured the perimeter and entered the office. "Break his hands, both of them. Make sure they never heal properly. Then hand him over to the feds, along with the unredacted port ledgers and the names of every politician he bribed. Let him rot in a tiny concrete box for the rest of his miserable life, knowing he is absolutely nothing." As Marcus began to scream, begging for a quick death, Claudio turned his back in disgust and walked out of the office, down the stairs, and out into the pouring rain. The brutal purging of his empire was complete. The rot was violently excised, but as he stood alone in the cold downpour, looking down at the blood staining his hands, feeling the phantom ache of the gunshot graze on his shoulder, he realized something profound. To truly protect Eva, to be the kind of man she deserved to stand beside, he couldn't just clean up the underworld. He couldn't just be a better monster. He had to leave the darkness entirely. 6 long, transformative months later, the bright spring sun shone warmly on 4th Street. Sweet Haven Bakery had undergone a complete renaissance. It boasted a fresh coat of cheerful yellow paint, a beautifully expanded outdoor seating area filled with wrought iron tables, and a line of eager customers that regularly stretched out the door and around the corner. The neighborhood was thriving, breathing easily, finally free from the oppressive, suffocating shadow of extortion and fear. Inside the bustling shop, the air was thick with the scent of sugar and coffee. Eva was laughing brightly as she handed a large, pristine white box of fresh pastries to a regular customer. She wore a bright, floral wrap dress that hugged her generous curves perfectly, radiating health, joy, and an unshakable, hard-won confidence. The ugly bruises that had marred her face were a distant, fading memory, replaced by a vibrant, undeniable glow of a woman entirely at peace. The little brass bell above the door chimed cheerfully. The noisy, bustling bakery seemed to quiet for just a fraction of a second as a tall, broad-shouldered man walked in. Claudio Ferraro wore a simple, well-fitted button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing his tattooed forearms and comfortable jeans, a stark, shocking departure from the dark, expensive, tailored armor of his past life. He looked remarkably relaxed. The heavy lines of stress around his eyes were gone. He looked, for the first time in his life, entirely free. He had spent the last grueling 6 months meticulously dismantling his illegal operations from the top down. He handed legitimate businesses over to his clean associates, paid massive anonymous restitutions, and violently severed all remaining ties to the mafia families on the East Coast. It had been a monumental, incredibly dangerous task, fraught with assassination attempts and legal battles. But he had survived it, driven daily by a single, unwavering purpose. Eva's bright hazel eyes met his across the crowded, aromatic room. Her heart leapt in her chest. She wiped flour from her hands onto her apron and walked around the long glass counter, meeting him in the very center of the busy shop. "You're late," she teased softly, though her eyes were shining with unshed tears of profound joy. "Traffic on the south side." Claudio smiled, a genuine, warm, devastatingly handsome expression that completely erased the harsh, terrifying lines of his violent past. He reached out, gently but firmly, wrapping his strong arms around her waist, pulling her soft, curvy frame flush against his solid one, oblivious to the stares of the customers. "Plus, I was delayed meeting with the commercial real estate agent. The space next door is officially yours, signed and sealed, if you want to expand the bakery and add that cafe you talked about." Eva wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her hands in his thick, dark hair. "I don't need more space, Claudio. I don't need anything else. I have everything I could ever want right here." He leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering, deeply passionate kiss to her lips right there in the middle of the shop, drawing a smattering of applause and cheers from the neighborhood regulars who knew their incredible story. Claudio had broken his own unbreakable rules for her. He had shattered a criminal empire for her, and in doing so, he had found his elusive moral redemption. He had ordered his men to bring her to him, expecting an enemy, but in the end it was Eva, with her rolling pin and her unyielding spirit, who had guided him out of the darkness and into the light. If you found your heart racing, your palms sweating, and your soul stirred by Claudio and Eva's intense, epic journey of love and redemption, make sure to hit that like button right now. This story proves that true strength isn't about wielding power, inspiring fear, or commanding empires. It's found in standing up for undeniable dignity, protecting the innocent at all costs, and finding the profound courage to completely change your life's path for true love. Eva's unyielding, beautiful resilience and Claudio's ultimate, hard-fought redemption show us that even a single spark of light can conquer the absolute darkest of empires. What did you think of Claudio's incredible transformation from ruthless mob boss to protector? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this epic, thrilling tale of romance, danger, and ultimate justice with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, cinematic, real-life drama fiction. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a heart-stopping story.